In today's video, I'm going to show you how I created this painting step by step. So first I found a reference image that I liked. I have it on my iPad too, so I can see the colors in more detail. And then I printed it so I could use it for a drawing. You can either draw these out by hand or trace them on a window if you'd like. So I have my line drawing, which is very light, and now I'm going to start with the background first. I do this because it's the farthest back element and it's fairly light, and I'm going to add a few layers to the background. But I'll start by mixing a color. I'm creating a blue that's fairly cool, but then I added just a little bit of orange to it to cool it down a little bit. And I'm going to use a wet on dry technique. I'm going to go right onto the paper. Because of that stucco wall, I can add a little bit more texture than I would if I were creating a wall that was super flat. So I actually am embracing that kind of unevenness of the watercolor as it dries because I think it'll add a nice layer of visual texture to my drawing or to my painting. I'm going to add a little bit more underneath the window box to kind of darken it, and then I'm going to dry it, make sure it's fully dry before I go on to this next layer. And for this next layer, I'm going to do the yellow of the window pane, or the window frames. And I'm just going to take a small brush and work wet on dry because I'm not covering a huge area. I don't need that to be evenly wet underneath, but I'm going to try to do a nice even application of my paint. Kind of move along with the form as I go. Sometimes it's helpful to rotate your paper as you're working on these too to get in those detailed nooks and crannies. I'm going to mix a slightly darker version of that yellow. I'm going to add a little bit of orange to it as well, and I'm going to use that to create that window box. And for this I'm using a larger brush, and I'm working wet onto dry because it's a smaller area. I don't need to add a wet onto wet wash. I'm going to be careful around those edges of the blue. I probably could have done this before the background as well, just so I didn't bleed any of that paint, but ended up being okay. So I'm going to let that dry fully, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to mix that shadow color around the window, and I'm probably going to add a few layers of the shadow color to get it nice and dark and add a little bit of texture, but here's my first layer. I'm leaving some little white areas there because I'll be painting flowers over the top of it. Now I'm going to mix a color for the window frame, or for the window pane, and there's curtains behind the window, and to give that feeling I'm going to create a wet and wet wash. So I'm going to wet that area first, and then I'm going to go in with my paint, and you can see how that makes it nice and smooth. I'm not getting too many brush strokes. That water underneath the paint that I lay down first, the clear water, helps move that paint around and give it almost that airbrushed look. So this is my first layer of these curtains, and I'm actually going to add a couple layers of texture over the top of it, but I want to get it fairly consistent feeling first. I have to be really careful with this step. I could use tape if I wanted to block off these window frames first, the yellow ones, but I'm doing it freehand here. Now I'm going to mix a darker orangey yellow for some of the shadow areas of the box. Those are some shadow areas underneath the plants that are going to be there. I'm going to use that same color, maybe adding a little bit of kind of greenish brown to it to create shadows within those window frames. And again, this is where it can be helpful to turn your paper around as you go. For demonstration's sake, I'm just doing it upright so you can see easier what I'm doing. Yeah, popping some of those shadows a little bit darker, and then I'm getting the soil underneath and some of the details of the window box. Adding a little bit of extra shading up at the top of the window. Now I'm going and creating some of those darker colors from those curtains that are behind that window. So this is going to rely on me to observe my reference image pretty closely. Again, I don't have to get exact. part of this is just getting the feeling and the colors right, and that'll hold so much of the image. So for this part, I'm not really going photorealistic with this. I'm just kind of getting a general sense of the forms and laying down marks that will reflect that. And I can add a few layers here. I like leaving some of my brush strokes visible. I'm going to go into the window and just pop a few more details in there. Blend things together. I can blur the edges a little bit with some just plain water on my brush too. Now I'm going to mix the lovely red of those plants. I'm going to go with a red and add some kind of cool blue to create a purple, maybe a little bit of green to neutralize it a little bit. And this part, again, I'm not getting exact to my photo. I'm just kind of looking at the general way that the plant moves in space to get a few of those down. I'm now going to add another layer of texture over my background too. So I wanted to create a little bit more texture to those stucco walls. And so I'm just using a thin layer of my same blue with a little bit of cooler blue mixed in there. And I'm doing that to kind of pop down the shadow underneath the window box and add some of that visual texture from the stucco wall. Now I'm going to go back into my flowers. Again, I'm using that red, and I didn't really have to worry about blocking out light areas because it's so much darker. If I was doing a lot lighter of a color flowers, I might have blocked some of those off with tape or Frisket before I got started. But since the red of these flowers is a lot darker, I can just paint it right over the blue and not have to worry about it. Again, not going for exact forms here, just kind of generalizing based on observing the shapes of the flowers. I'm going to mix a little bit of green too, and I really neutralize that green by adding some red into it and a little bit of black, just for those further out kind of tendrils of the flowers and some of the leaves at the base of the flowers. It's a subtle thing, but it adds a nice touch of detail. Then I'm going to add the brackets below. I added those last because I didn't want to have to paint around those. And they're darker than the underlying color, so I didn't have to worry about doing those until the very end. Now I'm just kind of going in and adding little areas of detail, popping in some extra shadows, little extra texture, maybe darkening a few areas. And then this is a fun part. The flowers are kind of lightly pink on the tips of these plants. So what I'm doing is I'm actually lifting paint out. I'm scrubbing the surface and then I'm blotting out the paint to create these kind of white forms that I'm then going to mix a light pink on and add a little bit of detail to that. It's a really subtle thing, but I think it adds a nice level of detail. So yeah, just going to touch up a few extra details here. My darker colors. I always do my darkest details last. Popping those shadows just that little extra bit. As I work on this, I kind of assess and look back and forth between my reference image to see if there's any areas that are inconsistent that I need to darken. And sometimes watercolor paint lightens as it dries too. So I have to kind of go back and add a little extra value. So now I get to do the fun part, which is peel off the edges and enjoy my painting. And again, if your watercolor paper is a little bit warped, you can always wet the back of it once it's dry evenly and not too saturated, and then lay it under some heavy books to dry overnight, and it'll be perfectly flat by the morning. Well, I hope you enjoyed making this or watching me make this watercolor painting.